A
Imagine
single vote
showing
in
up
the
to
U.S.
work
Senate can
every
freeze the
single
most
day,
powerful government
keeping
on Earth.
millions of people safe,
But right now,
knowing your paycheck
a political
has been
standoff
completely
threatens
cut
to
off.
blow up the rules forever.
Welcome
Yeah,
to the
we are watching
reality
the
of a
fundamental
United
machinery
States
of
government
American
shutdown.
lawmaking
It
just
is.
grind
It's a
to
pretty
an
grim
absolute
reality.
halt.
It
And
really
honestly,
is.
the
Right
physical
now,
toll on the
in
people
late
inside
March
that building
2026,
is about to
we are
become
witnessing
very real.
just a complete
Right, so let's set the
paralysis
scene.
of the Department of Homeland
It's March
Security.
2026.
And, you know, the
Picture the
collateral
hallways of
damage
the
is
United
spilling
States
right out of
Capitol right
Washington
now.
and straight into our
Aides
daily
are
lives.
literally
absolutely.
dragging
I mean, it is a
military-style
massive
cots
institutional
into back
failure
offices playing
Oh,
out
yeah.
in real time.
Staffers
We're
are
seeing things
stockpiling
that,
energy
quite
drinks by
frankly,
the case.
stretch
Exactly.
the
We're
limits of
looking
how
at a
federal
scenario where
agencies
senators
are legally
might
allowed
actively
to
refuse
operate.
to
Right.
drink water,
And it is
just so they don't have to
entirely
leave the
driven
floor
by
to use
this
the restroom.
fierce
Which is
standoff
wild,
over
and it's
domestic
all
policy.
because the Senate
So,
is
welcome to the
completely
deep dive. If
deadlocked
you're
over
listening to
the
this,
Save
you are
America
probably
Act.
standing
Right,
in
that
one of
big
those
election
4-hour
overhaul bill.
airport
It's
security
centered
lines
around
or,
measures like voter
just
ID
wondering how the
requirements.
system got so chaotic.
Democrats are
the lines
aggressively
are
blocking this
unbelievable right
legislation, and
Insane.
Republicans desperately want to pass it.
So
But
today,
they
our
lack the
mission
60
is
votes
to
required to break the
decode the
stalemate.
literal
Which means
machinery
frustrations
behind
are
this
just
crisis.
boiling
We took
over.
a massive stack
Today,
of source
you have 28
material,
Republican senators,
news
people like
reports
Pete
from
Ricketts
CBS,
and Cynthia
PBS, The
Loomis,
Guardian, NPR
demanding
News,
that the Senate
plus
force
a bunch of historical
grueling,
financial
physical,
data.
talking
Data to sift
filibuster.
through.
They want to force
And we
Democrats to
synthesized
stand on the
it,
floor
figure out
and
exactly
talk
how
until
these
their
federal
vocal
funding
cords
lapses
just give
actually
out. And if
work.
that fails,
We're going
they
to look
wanna
at that
break the standing
unprecedented
rules of the Senate
43-day shutdown
entirely
of
to
late
force a
2025
final vote.
and
And the real
untangle
shocker
the
dropped
political
just a few
gridlock,
days ago.
keeping
Senator
DHS
John
totally
Cornyn,
dark right
a man
now.
who fiercely
And we should
defended the old
explicitly
Senate
mention our
rules for his
tone
entire
Yes,
career.
good point.
Because
Just
these
published
sources contain
this
some highly
fiery
charged
op-ed.
political
Right,
viewpoints
saying
from
Republicans
both sides
must
of the
act
aisle.
now
Right,
to
very
get this
charged.
bill passed.
But
Yeah,
our
he
goal
said they
today
had
is
to deal
strictly
a
to
fatal
report the
blow to
facts
the rules,
impartially. We're
which
not
instantly
endorsing
triggered a
either
massive
side's
public
political
call-out from
agenda.
former
We're just
Senator
looking
Joe
at the
Manchin.
mechanics and the
Manchin
data.
slammed
Exactly, just
Cornyn
the
online
facts.
for,
So
well,
to really
a massive
grasp the
flip-flop.
magnitude
Because the
of
rules
this
of the Senate are
2026 crisis,
quite literally
we have to kind
hanging
of
by a
look
thread
under the
right now.
hood
I
of
mean,
the decisions made in the
itself,
next
right.
few days
Yeah,
will
you have to
dictate how
understand the
American laws
physical
are written for the
mechanism that
next
forces the
century.
United States to just
Welcome
turn
to this
its own
deep
lights
dive.
off.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't
Today,
happen
we
by
have a
accident.
custom mission
Let's start right
tailored
there.
just for
How
you.
does a shutdown
We're going to
actually
explore
happen
the
legally?
swashbuckling,
I mean, we have a
pirate-filled
constitution that
origins
separates
of the
powers,
filibuster.
right? And
It is a
Congress
crazy
holds the
history.
purse
It really
strings.
is.
Right. They're the only
We'll
ones
also
who can
break down
authorize
the
spending.
terrifying
But an
parliamentary
agency doesn't
weapon
just
known as the
spontaneously
nuclear
combust the
option.
second a funding
And
bill
finally,
expires.
we
There
will
has to be
unpack a
some rule
mind-bending
that
mathematical
forces
concept
everyone to go home.
called the
There is.
Manchin
And
paradox.
that mechanism
Right,
is actually
which proves
the
exactly why
Anti-Deficiency Act of
politicians use
1870.
gridlock
Wow,
as a highly
1870,
calculated
that's old.
mathematical
Very old.
strategy.
So after the Civil War,
By the end of this
federal
conversation,
agencies had this
you
habit
will
of
hold
just
the secret
spending whatever they
decoder
wanted
ring
and then
for the
handing
chaos
Congress
you
the
see
bill
on the
after
news.
the fact.
Like
you will
putting it on the
understand the
taxpayer
hidden
credit card.
game
Exactly.
theory that
And Congress got
drives
tired of
these
this,
high-stakes
so they
showdowns.
passed the Anti-Deficiency
Absolutely.
Act.
Okay, let's unpack
This law
before
makes
we
it
can
a federal
truly
crime,
grasp the physical
literally
threats
a
and the
crime,
massive
for a
stakes
government official
of this
to
2026
spend money
FZV
or even
America
enter
Act
into a
standoff.
contract without
We
explicit
really need to
prior
look at what the
approval from
filibuster
Congress.
actually
Wait, a
is.
and more
crime?
importantly, how
Yeah.
it started.
If you spend
Because it
unauthorized
wasn't
money, you
designed
face
this way by
fines
the
and
founders,
potential
right?
prison
Like
time.
this wasn't in
Oh,
the
wow.
blueprint.
Not
But
at
the
all.
government
If you
didn't
read the
always
US
shut down like it
Constitution,
does
you will
today,
not
right?
find the word
Because
filibuster
for
anywhere in
roughly
the
a
text.
century
Well,
after that law
nowhere.
passed,
Nowhere.
if
The
Congress missed a
Constitution
deadline,
basically gives the
agencies
Senate
just
the
kinda kept the
authority
lights
to
on.
set its
They
own
did.
internal
They
rules.
operated at a
So back
minimum
in
level.
1789,
They assumed
during
the money
very
was coming
first
eventually,
sessions, debates
and nobody went
ended
to
with
jail.
just a
So
simple majority
why did
vote.
that suddenly
Okay,
change?
so
The
51
turning
votes,
point
and you're
happened
done.
during the Carter
Exactly.
administration.
Okay.
But there was this
In
massive
1980
loophole.
and 1981,
They
Attorney
never
General Benjamin
codified a
Civiletti
specific procedure
issued
to
these
force
legal
a vote to
opinions
happen
that
if
completely
someone simply
reinterpreted
refused to
that
stop talking.
1870 law.
Ah.
He read it
So without a mechanism
hyperliterally.
to cut off
Interesting.
debate,
He concluded that if there is
politicians
no
figured out
money
they could
officially
just,
appropriated,
hold the floor
continuing to
hostage.
They
operate
did.
is a direct
We actually
criminal
have
violation.
diaries from the
You
very first
absolutely must
session
shut
of the
down.
Senate. Pennsylvania
But
Senator
he
William
built in a
McClay
crucial
wrote down his
caveat.
sheer
And that is-
It's
frustration
called
that
the
senators
life
from
and property
Virginia were
exception.
intentionally talking away the
Let me
clock.
guess.
Just to
If
make sure a
shutting an
specific
agency
bill
down
couldn't
means
pass.
people die
Right.
or
They
physical
literally
property is destroyed,
weaponized the
they are
clock.
legally
if they were
forced
holding
to
the
keep
legislative
working.
process
That is the
hostage
core of
makes
it.
perfect
Yeah.
sense why the press
That
eventually
single legal
started calling them
interpretation
pirates.
created the modern
Which brings us to
framework
the
we live
actual
with
word
today. It
filibuster.
forced all
Yeah,
the
it's easily one of the strangest words in
non-essential
American
workers to be
politics.
locked
So
out
where
of
does
their
it come
offices.
from?
Right.
And
The etymology
it legally
is
compelled
fascinating,
all
honestly. The term
essential
really
workers,
took hold in the 1850s.
like law enforcement,
It
air
comes
traffic
from the
controllers,
Dutch
border
word
patrol agents,
"rebeuter"
to
and the Spanish
continue
word
doing their highly
"filibustero,"
stressful
Which
jobs for
translates
zero
directly
pay.
to freebooter
until the
or
politicians
pirate,
figure it
Yes.
out.
Exactly.
It's like cutting the
Specifically,
power to a
the
massive
mercenaries
complex
and
factory
pirates who raided
just to
Caribbean
save
islands
on the
and
electricity
Latin
bill.
American countries
That's a great way
during
to
that
put it.
era.
You know, just
So
flip
they
a
were
switch
calling
and
these
pause time.
distinguished
The
senators
sensitive
pirates.
machinery breaks
Pretty
down
much.
from sudden power
The
loss.
term entered the political
perishable
lexicon
inventory
because
on the floor
observers
just
recognized the
spoiled.
behavior.
Rats.
And when you finally
Senators who
turn the
talked
lights
for
back on,
hours
the
were
cost of
literally
repairing the
hijacking the
damage
Senate
and
floor.
restarting those
Like taking
assembly
the government
lines
hostage,
is
just
10
like a pirate
times what you
taking
saved the
a
first
ship.
place.
Exactly.
And the data
So let's
strongly
track how the
supports
Senate
that
tried to
analogy.
fight off these
Shutdowns
legislative
do not
pirates.
save taxpayer money.
Because as the country
burn it.
grew,
Which is
you couldn't just
wild
have
to
one
think
person
about.
shut
When
down
you
the
look at
entire
the
government for
historical
weeks on
financial
end.
data,
No, you
The
couldn't.
16-day
But it took a long
shutdown
time to
back
build a
in
defense.
2013
By the early
cost the
20th
government an
century, these
estimated
marathon
$2.1
speeches
billion
became
in lost
catastrophic for a
productivity and
modernizing
administrative
nation.
restart
I can
costs.
So finally, in
Right. And then
1917,
the 35-day
President Woodrow
shutdown
Wilson
across
pushed the Senate
2018
to
and
adopt
2019
Rule 22.
permanently shaved
This rule
$3 billion
created a
off
formal
the gross
process
domestic
called
product.
cloture,
The
Closure,
Congressional
okay.
Budget Office tracks
which
this
is
stuff,
simply a
and the
mechanism
math
to
is
force
just
an end to debate.
universally
But
negative.
Okay,
here's
so
the
I have to
catch.
push back here.
It required
If the data
massive
universally
two-thirds
proves that
majority
this
vote to
strategy
trigger.
costs
Two-thirds,
taxpayers
wow,
billions
which is an
of dollars
incredibly
and
steep hill
actively
to
damages
climb.
the American
So
economy.
step
That over
what
the next
is the
4
strategic
decades,
value?
the Senate only
Why
managed
do
to successfully
politicians
invoke
keep reaching
cloture
for a
5
tool that
times?
basically detonates
That
in
is
their own
wild.
hands? Yeah.
Because,
Southern senators
simply
famously
put,
used this
a government
exact tool to
shutdown is the
block
ultimate
civil
form
rights
of political
legislation
leverage.
for years.
Leverage.
The
Yeah.
gridlock grew
In a
so
heavily
intense
polarized
that in
Washington,
1975,
passing
the Senate
standalone
lowered that
bills is
threshold
incredibly
from
difficult.
two-thirds down to 60
So, when a
out of the
massive
100
must-pass
total
funding
senators.
deadline approaches,
okay. And that
lawmakers
60
use the
vote
threat of a
threshold is the
shutdown
number
to
that
force the opposing
dominates our
party to
politics
swallow
today.
policy changes
Exactly.
they would never
But
agree
here's
to
where I think a
otherwise.
lot of people
I
get
see.
confused.
It is a high-stakes
When we hear the
game
word
of political
filibuster,
chicken.
we
The
don't
logic
just
is
think of a
simple. I will
60 vote
inflict
math
billions
problem.
of dollars of
We
pain on the
picture
country until
Jimmy
you give me
Stewart
what I
and Mr.
want.
Smith goes
Assume
to
the voters will
Washington.
blame
Right,
you
a classic
before they blame
movie
me.
scene.
Yeah.
It's a total
we picture a
hostage
single person
dynamic.
standing at
And
a
that
podium,
brings us
reading
directly
the
to the
phone book,
historic
sweating,
exchange we saw
refusing to
just a few
sit
months
down.
ago.
Right, late
But
2025.
senators rarely
The
do that
2025
anymore. Why
government
don't they have
shutdown
to
started
physically
on
talk
October
today?
1st.
That
and did
is a
not
crucial
end
piece
until
of the
November
puzzle.
12th.
So in the
At 43
1970s,
days,
the Senate
it
created
shattered
something
the record
called
to
the
become the
two-track
longest
system.
government
Two-track
shutdown in
system. How did
United
that work?
States history.
Well, before
It
the
really
system,
did.
a filibuster
And reading
stopped all
through these
Senate business
NPR News and
completely.
Guardian reports,
Nothing
I
else
was
could
actually
happen.
surprised to
The
see
Senate
this wasn't
realized they had a
initially
whole
about the
country to
border
run,
or
so
national
they changed the
security.
procedure.
It
Makes
was
sense.
triggered by a
Under the new
dispute
system,
over
if a senator
healthcare.
simply threatened to
Specifically,
filibuster a bill,
Affordable
the
Care
Senate
Act
leadership would
subsidies.
just
Right.
set that
Senate
controversial bill
Democrats
aside on a
blocked a
different track and
continuing
move on
resolution
to
to
other
fund the
business.
government
Oh, wow.
because it
So they
failed
made
to
it
extend
painless.
certain
You didn't have
ACA
to stand up
subsidies
and
they
destroy
deemed
your vocal
critical.
cords anymore. You just sent an email saying,
When that funding bill
I
failed,
object, and
the
the
entire
bill was
government
frozen.
ground to a halt. Like a
Which
silent
exposes a
filibuster.
major
You capture the
structural flaw
dynamic
to me,
perfectly
because I
the
assume
physical endurance
43-day
requirement
shutdown would
basically
be about
something
vanished.
universally
But
catastrophic,
the fiscal
like
records from
defaulting on the
before and
national
outside
debt.
that
Sure, that
silent
makes sense.
system,
How does a localized
those
dispute
remain
over
pretty
healthcare
legendary.
subsidies
Oh, absolutely.
instantly
Strom
snowball
Thurmond
into
spoke
defunding
against
National
the Civil
Parks
Rights
federal
Act in
courts and
1957
scientific research
for 24
Well, it happens
hours in
because
the
Congress
Imagine
abandoned
finding
the
out your
traditional
hours
budget process
is
and the
secretly
modern
funding
individual
the
records
What do you mean?
statutory Instead of
voting
passing
Right.
12
It is
individual
pretty
funding
In April
bills for different
2025,
parties.
Booker spoke
Right.
for an
Well,
astonishing
imagine
25
for a second
hours
that
and
you
5
have a
minutes
savings account.
Instead of
against
doing
the
that
policies of the
and
Donald
bundle
Trump
everything
administration.
into these
I mean, just think
giant
about the
family,
bottom line of the
multi-trillion dollar
This
omnibus
money
packages
was
you cannot
strictly
sit
for
down
everything
and
is
leave
tied
down,
together.
lean on
Oh,
your
so it's
desk.
all
You
So
can't even leave the
if you
chamber
don't
for a
fix this
bathroom
so
a
break.
localized
It is the House's
disagreement
gonna
over
brutal,
healthcare
It's an
dangerous
existential
acts
crisis for the
like a
House.
computer
Exactly.
virus
And
that
the
crashes
House
the entire
really
operating
reminds
system.
me of a
And the
passenger
collateral
breaks down
damage
train.
from that
Spend
crash
too
was
much on
decides to
groceries,
just
you've got bills
yank
piling
the
up.
According to the
emergency
data,
brake, throwing everyone else into the walls just because they don't like the
pay off your
final
credit
destination.
cards and tell your
It is
family,
a
hey, don't worry,
highly
I fixed it
disruptive
later.
maneuver.
And
another
Wait, that raises a
1.4
glaring
million
question.
essential
The
workers
roof
were
of this
forced to
plant
stay on the
is
job
so
completely
universally
unsuspected.
disruptive.
By day 20,
Every
the economic
majority
output loss hit an
self-inflicted
estimated
hates it.
$7
One
billion.
$1.5
$1.5
billion.
billion.
Why
But
haven't
the
they
element
voted
that
to
really
destroy
stood out
it?
in the
Completely
source
avoidable
that
was
is
the
the
Senate
core
peaking.
Welcome to
tension
the
of the
DPS,
United
the
States
supplemental
Senate.
Today we're
nutrition
exploring
The
system.
reason the
classic case
filibuster
of-
This is where the
survives is that
bureaucratic
permanently
coming out of
destroying it
Annapolis.
requires a maneuver
We are
so
looking at the
extreme
strategic
and so
energy
destructive to the
investment
institution
SNAP is
that it earned a
administered by the
terrifying
USDA. It's a
nickname.
huge and it relies on a
Exactly.
continuous
Exactly.
safety
The
environment.
nuclear
Federal
option.
funds.
But it sounds like
Turning
a
into
Cold
hidden
War
tax.
threat.
Not a bank
Let's
account.
walk
Every
through the
single
actual
person
floor mechanics.
paying an
Requires
electric
actual
bill. How does a
return
retirement
transfers.
actually
And it really
work
is
this
because the center of a
Okay, let's
huge
break
war
down
in
the
parliament
fight.
reach.
You've got a
$42
Democratic
million
governor,
changing
frustrated
standings,
environmentalists making some very awkward
42 million.
compromises,
overwhelming
and conservative
Pennsylvania
critics
and
who are
Texas
rightly
Which in
calling
our
this
highly
whole thing a
polarized
shell
modern
public
politics,
services, warning
securing
when you
residents
look
that
at the
government
documents we
benefits
have
change
today,
rule
reported
basically
budget
mathematical.
At the
proposals,
same
critiques
time,
from Senate
President Trump
Republicans.
So they found
attempted
a
to
big
unilaterally
really
lay off
Our
mission
mission
100 that
bypass
federal
the
and follow the
67
money
vote requirement
Always
permanently
follow the
reduce the
money.
work
We are going to
force during
see
step-by-step
how a
process
federal
designed
judge
to fight
temporarily
climate
bailed
change
on that
is being
maneuver.
used
First,
to
when
plug
a Senate
holes
majority
in budget
incredibly stands up,
and we'll dig into the
and
argument
argues
that
that
this isn't found money at
room,
all.
they basically
This
tell the
essentially
presiding
exactly
officer
what
that
tax on
the
family
written
holds
rule
the
Let's
meant
get
something
right into it. But
entirely
the
different than
strategic
what
energy
the text
investment
actually
The
says.
politicians
So the majority
rely on
leader
that
basically
real
stands
world
up and
pain
claims
to
it's the
actually
sky.
generate
Well,
the public
essentially, on
outcry
paper.
necessary
Then the
to
presiding
force
officer looks at the
compromise.
physical rulebook and
Eventually,
says,
the pressure
no,
on
I
Tier
is
2
land
amendments
order by the
and
Maryland
43-day
The text
shutdown
says what its
ended
whole
in
stated
mid-November.
purpose
The only
is to
logical
reduce
response.
energy
They
bills.
only patched the
But
problem.
here is the
They
trend
didn't
fund.
actually
Majority
fix the
leader
underlying
immediately
dysfunction,
appeals
like
to
solar
and that
panels and
legislative
efficiency
dysfunction
upgrades.
rolls
Understand
right
Senate
into the new
but
year.
here is the real
Deciding
following
a
a
brief
four-day
shutdown
a
in
simple
early
majority
Where does
of
the money
61
actually
Congress
go?
managed to
So
pass
the majority
funding for
parties, they
most of
aren't
the
just in
government
unison to
override
override
Most
the
of
chair.
it, yeah.
But
No,
the
and that's
moment
why
specifically
politicians
carved
absolutely
out
love
the
it. It
Department
feels
of
freeing.
Homeland Security.
So
about
brand
40%
new
comes
they
from
only
regional
gave
carbon
DHS
offsets.
completely overwrites the
But
and
the
when that
big chunk,
expired on
the one
February
growing like
14th,
crazy, comes from
DHS
something
went
called
dark.
alternative
They rewrite the
As of
rules
late
using
March
a simple
2026,
majority,
which is just a
ignoring
fancy
the
government
67
term for
vote
fine.
requirement.
Right.
It's a
So
violation.
we're a failure.
It's
Let me
like
break it
shutdown
down.
of the largest
Sitting down to play a
Maryland law
board game,
forces
apparatus.
utility
right in the
companies
middle
to
of a
buy
tight
some
match,
map
your
out
team
friction
decides to
points
rewrite the
to
instruction
help
manual
renewables.
just because you happen to have one extra
Democrats
player
view
at the
interest
table.
rates,
That's a great way to
operational
put it.
But
overhauls
that
to
guarantees
immigration.
retaliation.
Yeah,
the
the
state
state
The
gives them
moment
an
the other
excise
team gets an
tax.
extra
The
player,
utility
they're
really
going to
heavily
rewrite the
following the
rules
highly
again.
publicized death
And
after
if we
US
connect the citizens
bigger
who were killed
picture,
by
here's
federal
you can
agents
see
in
how this weapon has
Minneapolis.
steadily
Utilities
grown
aren't
and
flash.
escalated over the
Recently,
last
Democrats are
every
refusing
time
to
a party
authorize
pushes
the
that
DHS
button
funding without
a new
new
part of the
mandatory
mandatory
guard
And the
forms
retaliation
law
just becomes
enforcement.
more severe.
Incredibly
They
Track
want
that
ICE
escalation for us.
agents
When did this
required
start?
to wear body cameras.
Well, the term itself
Displaying
came around in
strategy
2003 with Senator
Precisely.
Scott
It
It
is
is
a
Senator
during
Ted Stevens
operation
previously called
and
it
obtained
Hulk
judicial
option.
the government
Hulk
made them
option.
entering
So
aggressive
aggressive,
and the
and
market
Those are
is
very
distorted because it
significant
implies
operations.
mutually assured destruction
And the Republicans,
the
along
first
with
major
President
launch
Trump,
happened in
are utilizing this exact
Democrats,
same
led by Harry
legislative
Reid,
bottleneck
in 2022
to push
this
their
revenue
own
was
agenda.
$7 million.
They are
So
demanding
they used the
increased
nuclear
funding
option
for
to
border
drop the
security
threshold
operations.
51 votes for lower
But more
court judges
importantly,
and
they are
executive branch
insisting that any
nominees.
DHS but they explicitly left an exception
Right,
must
so now
include
the
the
state has
passage
this,
of the
but
Save
4 years
America
later,
Act.
in 2017, the balance of power
supposedly
swung
for
back.
green
That
Republicans,
legislation would
led by
mandate that
remember that money
individuals
didn't
show
just
proof
fall out
of
of the sky.
citizenship
And they
and
retaliated
photo
for that
ID
2013
in order
rule
to
change.
vote.
So they
in
fired
federal
back.
elections.
Because
Exactly.
Democrats are drawing a
They
hard
used the
line
nuclear
on law
option to
enforcement reform,
vaporize
and
that
Republicans
final
are
round
drawing a
hard
hard
line
line
They passed
on pushing
every
through
single penny
nominees.
of that
These
on
are
the
two
budget.
Exactly. It
completely
shows up
distinct,
right on your
Wow.
highly
So
charged
you nuke my
domestic
lower
everyday
court nominees,
ratepayer
I
that
nuke your
are
Supreme
paying
Court
for
picks.
nothing to do
And that
failure
exact
to meet
cycle
green
of
mandate
mutually
of the
assured
Coast Guard.
destruction
The state
brings us
collects your
directly
money,
back to the
yet
crisis
these
at
demands are
today
colliding.
in
Look at all
March
this cash they
2026.
took off right back to the
Which brings us
standoff
to
over
the
the
right.
Save America Act.
Right, because that money is definitely not staying. Democrats are fiercely
Not anymore.
opposed to
Enter
the use of
Governor
silent
Wes
filibuster
Moore.
to freeze the
And right his
legislation.
administration
Now
is staring
Donald
down
Trump and those
injected
28
$1.5
Republican
billion
senators
They want to tear up that comforting two-track
$1.5
system and
billion.
force
Bad
a
timing.
grueling,
You can't just ignore a
physical
whole lot.
over the leadership of a department.
You
And
wanna
when
bring out the
government
cops
overspends
and force
that
Democrats
degree,
to
the
talk
irony
until
is
they
almost
collapse.
too obvious
Or
cushions for
we
have
wanna
an
push
agency
the
whose
nuclear
literal
button
name is
again
Homeland
and
Security,
kill the
and it's the one
filibuster for
left in our
legislation
fund.
entirely.
And the loose
Our
change
lawmakers
crisis
effectively
highlights
holding
a
a
glaring
glaring
national
So what's the actual
hostage.
proposal
You
on
brought
the
up the
50-50?
public
The
fight
governor's
between
plan
Senator
diverts
John
By the
Cornyn
literal
and
definition of the
$900 million
tax.
directly
Both sides
from
calculate
Cornyn
this the
into
op-ed,
the
saying
general
Republicans must
fund.
use their fatal blow to the rules.
Just to cover their
outweighs the
overspending.
political damage.
Manchin pointed out the
They
total
are
hypocrisy.
using
They are
energy
just
funds
noting that Cornyn used to
for
personally
general
thank him
government
for defending
operations.
that
While
exact
Bureaucracy,
statement.
salaries, office supplies,
exercise
you name
of
it.
leverage.
But that's not even all of it.
Physical
I read in the
Clear,
sources there's also a
undeniable
rebate
pattern
spunk.
emerges.
Yes,
Which brings
this
the
is the part
consequence
critics
of
are calling a
standoff.
political
Both
parties
parties
are
furiously
grabbing
defend
another
$100 million out of
their
funds
soaring
to
to
give
give
a
a
one-time
one-time
$40
rebate
rebate
to
Transportation
eligible
Security
households
Administration, the
$40.
TSA,
It's all about
operates
traditional
under
So let me
DHS.
get this straight.
The very
The
and
state
because
mandates
DHS
drive up
funded
energy
majority,
costs.
50,000
Utility
states
companies
have
pass those
currently
massive
going to
costs
ram
to
their
you
own
and me.
agenda.
And we are seeing
Our
the
bills
bills
go
go
up
by
by
hundreds of
both
dollars
parties
a year. Secretly want this
And then the
rule
governor
gone.
takes
The
a
moment
chunk
we
of our own
legally
mandate,
So
hands us back
why do we
a
still
crisp
have it?
$40
That is the
bill,
million-dollar
and
question.
basically
Like,
says,
let's look at
you're
Joe
welcome.
Manchin in
Then the
2026.
sources outline
Yeah.
how
He's a
massive it's
moderate
why.
Democrat.
And if you look
He
at the
faced
recent
immense
supplemental
blistering
budget,
pressure
they're
from his
cutting
own
or
party.
shifting another
He killed
$80
the
million.
filibuster
When you
so
add
they
all
could
this
pass their
up, this
voting
raid
rights agenda.
depletes the fund by
But he
82
refused.
million.
80% of the fund wiped out.
Actively
sacrificed
leaving only
his
about
own party's
$164
goals
million
just
for
to
the
protect
actual
a
green
60
initiatives
vote
to legally
procedural
end
rule.
Baltimore's
That is not
BWI.
why on
But the
earth that's a
CBS
good
and PBS
politician
reports
willingly
highlight
give
and
up
this
the
is
power
massive
to politics
legislative
gets super
loophole that
interesting.
makes
Well, the
Because
answer
you would
has
assume
very
the
little to do
environmentalists
with
with
so
blind
strict like
tradition
the
or
Sierra
TSA agents
Club
are
or
going
the
unpaid.
It is actually
But
Climate
ICE
Action Network.
agents are operating
You'd assume they'd be
normally at a
furious.
restricting their
They
paychecks.
were
Realize the loophole
This dynamic is
And
when
it's
this
a
first came out, they
fascinating
called it
use of
unacceptable.
legislative
They said it was a
concept
known
huge
as
mistake
ICE
to
is
use
fully
this
funded
money
mansion
as a
paradise.
petty
Okay,
cash
let's dive
jar.
into the math.
But
How's
then
that?
they
So
folded.
they completely
Last year,
folded.
Congress
Now
passed
they
a
are
sweeping
actually
package
supporting
known as
parts
the
of the
One
governor's
Big
spending
Beautiful
models
Bill
to
Act.
demonstrate
Talk about
why
strange
Tucked
spending
inside that
voter,
legislation
like a
is a
moderate
$75
senator,
billion
right,
dollar
If they
budget
truly believe
expansion.
climate change is
Specifically
actually
for
gains
financial crisis,
significantly
spread out
more
over the
power
state
when a
raid
state
Wait,
is
is
that
that
normal?
normal?
In
It's just
Congress
raw
just
political
calculations.
calculations.
They
They
know
never have
voters
to
are
worry
getting
about
Say I'm
crushed
the
by
Democratic
inflation and
leader.
high
Should
energy
I want to
prices
pass a
now.
massive
If
spending
these
bill
green
proposed to
groups
keep
attack
Let's say I want to spend
$40
$10
rebate,
billion
even if it's a
so
total
they can
$10
maintain
million,
oversight
they look
and,
like they don't care about working
leverage.
Right.
Now let's say
So they have to
Senator
by
Manchin,
securing
they
that
are
$75
swallowing a
billion
very
in a
bitter
previous
pill.
separate
In
law.
exchange for letting
ICE
the governor
became
raise
completely
ideal
funded
moderate
at
target,
current
they are
appropriations.
lobbying for a
Their
new
funding is
law
already
to
leadership
create a
wants 10,
funding
the
floor.
moderate wants
This
4.
creates
Let's
such a
meaning what?
surreal
Yeah,
dynamic
Senate
on
with
the
no
meeting.
filibuster.
They wanted Trump
Simple
announced a
majority
highly
rule.
controversial
If I'm the
warrant,
leadership
roughly
and I only need 51 votes to pass this,
$365
this may allot a headline
on
mansion on.
climate
I
spending.
walk
Because
into
he
his
has a
office and
fleet
I'm
of
going to
fully
throwing
paid
today's
ICE
taxpayers
agents
under the bus
and a severe
to lock in a
shortage of
permanent
just
claim on
mapped
Wall
out
Street
scenario.
later.
That's the gambit.
His administration
brings us
billion,
right
right?
to the
ICE
core
agents are to major commercial airports to
People
help
like Senate
manage
Minority
it
Leader
because
Katie Britt
billion
aren't
is
pulling
slightly
them
better
in.
for
It's like a
citizens
restaurant
than
where
getting
the
Not for a
specialized
second. Let's
chefs
walk
are
through their
locked out
argument,
without
because
So
it
he
really
compromises.
exposes
So
them
management
badly,
brings
if that
in the
makes sense.
highly
They call it
paid
the
valet
hidden
drivers
Right.
to top the
Let's
best
be
bows.
rigorous
He gets
about
his
the
face
face
on
They
it
both work for the
every
restaurant.
step one,
where
their
the
skill
state
sets
forces
and training
him
entirely
that
he
he
totally
actually
disconnected
disconnected
from
from
economic
The
reality.
administration
Right.
acknowledges
Because
the
the
final
final
bill
bill
remains
remains
much
much
closer.
closer. They
Logistically,
pay
ICE
Step
agents
three,
are not trained
utilities
on
raise your
complex
electric
executive
rate to
machinery
cover the
or the
costs.
highly
Step
specific
four,
screening
state
protocols
grabs that
so how
fine
does
money to
scenario
pay
B
for
what are they
general
actually
government
doing
bloat?
at the airport?
Well,
Exactly.
scenario
So
B
in effect,
Reports
the
indicate
state
these
is
deployed
taxing
ICE
electric
agents are
users
primarily
now,
focusing
the
on
leadership
security
will not
exits
just
and managing
ally
crowd
on
control.
without ever having to
It
publicly
temporarily
on a
eases
tax
some
hike
pressure,
Hershey says, but
which means they have to find those extra 9
logistical
votes
and
somehow.
jurisdictional
Exactly. And to do that, they
and
have
then
to
you pay
cross
this
the
one
aisle
massive
and
surcharge
win over
on law
moderate
enforcement
Republicans.
agencies
Think of
like
senators like
Energy
Mitt
Department.
Romney or
Is it
even
politically
legally
convenient?
or
And those Republicans are going to
And
demand
there is a second
deep,
layer of this
aggressive
criticism,
cuts to
the
that
sheer
$10
hypocrisy
billion
of
price
it all.
tag
This is
band-aid
the-
before they
With
even
the
consider
airports in a
clearing
state of
yards.
chaos and
Politicians
50,000
constantly
workers
tell us
desperate
climate
for a
change is an
paycheck, the
existential
lawmakers are
threat.
scrambling
They say
for
the world is
facts.
burning.
But the compromises
red
being
for
pitched are
humanity.
just as complicated as the shutdown
forces
itself.
the leadership
Yeah, let's
to
look at the
drop
Senate.
Critics are
price
asking
The
tags
latest
all the way
Republican
down
compromise
to
is being led by
$6
Senator
billion.
John
This is the most
Thune.
urgent crisis.
His
Here's where it
pitch
gets
is to
really
pass a
interesting.
targeted bill that funds 90% of DHS. That would instantly restart projects for the TSA, the Coast
That is
Guard,
the grand
and emergency
reveal
management
of
This
personnel.
proves the whole climate
By
panic is
vigorously
just
However, he
protecting the
proposes
60
withholding
vote filibuster,
$5.5
Manchin
billion
intentionally gives up his
to
glamorous
specifically
status as
earmarked
way
for
too
important
decisive
deportation
to
green projects
Wait,
they claim
if
by
ICE
doing
is
so,
the core of the
he forces
Democratic
the entire
fund,
Senate
why would
to pull the
Republicans and it
legislation
entirely undermines
because the
those
Republican
rules?
strategy is to take
If
that
the money isn't
$5.5
sacred,
billion,
then the
incredibly
crisis
package
clearly
it together
isn't
with the
as
Save the
urgent
America Act.
to voter ID
Let's talk about the
legislation.
real-world consequences
try to
and
pass them
find
both
votes
because
separately.
while
While
politicians are moving hundreds of millions around on spreadsheets,
Okay, stop right there.
It
He gives
affects
away
the
budget
actual
reconciliation
grid.
leverage to
What gets left behind when you
avoids the
drain
60 vote
82%
filibuster
of the
hurdle
fund?
in the
Well,
Senate,
programs
allowing
for
authority
electric
to
to
pass
pass
bills for low-income
The Stanford
households.
study
Why don't
proves
they
that
just use
moderate
it?
And
politicians
a Hebrew
defend the
question
60
lowers
vote
the
What's
bill
stopping the
because it
Republicans
acts
from
as a
jamming the
gravitational
Save America
pull.
Act
Instead,
through
they're
reconciliation
softly
right
dragging
now to
long-term
end
legislation
infrastructure
from
for
either end
because budget reconciliation is governed by incredibly reorients how you view
They're
the
also
gridlock
cutting
in
electric
Washington.
school buses, induction
When we
stoves,
see these
road
threats
projects.
and
Here's the
yield to
ultimate
pass,
reality.
it is not just
Flawed
politicians
solution
acting
before
like
this
petulant
policy
children.
change.
Just to avoid
Massive
rigorous
filibuster
mathematical
mathematical
strategy
provision
behind
in
a
the
reconciliation bill
Absolutely.
must have a
When you
direct
understand the game
primary
theory,
impact
you
on the federal
realize
budget.
politicians now
Merit
strictly
strictly
deals with federal spending, revenues, the nuclear threat, that they are all just levers.
Changing
But a
national
University of
voting
Maryland
requirements does not
analysis shows
impact
that
the
under
federal
current
budget.
policies,
Even
the state is
conservative
only going to
Republican
hit
senators
40
like
to
Mike Lee
45%.
journeyed from
They
public
are
states
miles
to
behind.
trying to
So
pass
we're
the
missing
Save
the
America
target.
Act
The grid is
through
getting
reconciliation
recreation
of the
is
silent two
and
tracks
now
system
impossible
money
to
into
politics
politics
because it governs
speaking
electric
for $25 million
general
fund
expenditures.
to cover deficits.
Unsurprisingly,
Yeah.
Democratic
When we
leaders
mapped out
like
the
Senators
parliamentary
Katie
checks
Britt and
for
Chuck Schumer have
explored
flatly
the
rejected the
explosive
same
2026
time,
showdown
they are
of the
insisting
Save the
that the
America Act,
operational
and finally
reforms,
impact
but
brilliant game theory
mandating the body
that proves
cameras and
gridlock
car
can actually be a
fines
weapon of
must be
moderation.
codified in the
grid
mechanics of
stability.
the Senate.
When
They
you
are
force
refusing
these
to accept
transitions
a
faster
temporary
than
handshake
technology
deal
allows,
or a promise of future
penalize
votes in exchange
reliable
for
energy
turning the lights
sources,
back on.
costs explode. And if you look over at the House for next time you
That's
watch
exactly why those
Situation
fines are
News,
so
you see
high.
senators
Reliable
dragging
green
costs
energy
into
just
Nevada
isn't
representative
available
who
at the
demanded
scale the
nuclear
law
option
demands.
a
So the
now
state is
hold the
literally
secret
penalizing the
billion-dollar
grid.
markup
You know what's
for
actually
DHS
going on
funding.
behind closed
And
doors?
instead of
You know
using
that
the
it's
bad
not
example
just
of
random
why these
partisans
bills
take
meeting the
so long
mandates
to
are
pass.
unrealistic,
It is a high-stakes
the
game
government
of
just
mathematical
treats the
chess.
fines
Let's
as
define
their
it.
revenues.
Policy writers are brings us
how
back
much
to the most
power to
disturbing
wield
part of this
and
moment,
exactly
right?
how
They
far
are
they can push the
hyper-specific
rules
instructions
before the
dictating
entirely
exactly
drill down us.
what an
And
agency
honestly,
can
the
and
stakes
cannot
right
do
now
in
in
2026 have
billion
never been higher.
Representative
Every
Emily's
time a
bill
new precedent
includes
is
riders that would
established, and the Green
completely
Senate
zero
edges
out
closer to
humanitarian
having a
shelter
simple
grants
majority
southern
of
border.
utilities are
His
failing
pitch
to
includes
losing
another
goals,
rider so
moderating
advantages surgeon is actually medical care for ICE somehow, which brings us to a final thought. By attaching these highly controversial social we constantly complain about state budget. We hate the frustrating lawmakers basically guarantee a fight.
The government now has a massive
bills in
financial
modern
interest.
Washington
Everyone hates
are almost never just about keeping the lights on. They are legislative Trojan
and the governor is left with.
Let's bring this all together.
We mapped out the historical data proving that government shutdowns cost taxpayers billions of dollars while
It's a total
actively
dependency on failure.
And the data on that is very clear.
dirty energy. We dissected the devastating 43-day
doctor who only
shutdown
gets
of
paid
late
if
of 2025.
A single vote in the U.S.
showing how a
Senate can
dispute
freeze the
over
most
healthcare
powerful government on
subsidies
earth.
drained the USDA's
But right now,
reserves and
A
threatened
political
food security
standoff
for
threatens to
42
blow up the
million
rules forever.
Americans.
A massive
we are
ripple
watching
effect.
the fundamental
We
machinery
examined
of
the bizarre
American
reality
lawmaking
playing out
just
in our airports today,
grind
where fully
to an
paid ICE
absolute halt.
agents
And
are stepping
honestly,
in
the
to manage
physical
crowds
toll on the people
while
inside that building is
50,000
about to
highly
become
trained
very
TSA
real.
agents
Right,
work
so
without
let's set the
pay.
scene.
And we
It's
walk
March
through the intense
2026.
procedural gridlock,
Picture
keeping
the
the Department
hallways
of
of the
Homeland
United
Security
States Capitol right now.
paralyzed over voter
voting
needs
laws
are
and law
literally
enforcement
dragging
reform.
military.
The overarching
cops
theme here really
into
is the
back
weaponization of the
offices.
federal budget.
Oh, yeah.
The physical
Staffers are
operation of the
stockpiling
government
energy
has
drinks
become
by the case.
secondary to
Exactly.
the
We're
political
looking at a
leverage its
scenario where
absence
senators
creates.
might actively
And if
refuse
you are
to
listening
drink
to this
water
right now,
just so they don't
none
have
of
to
this
leave
is
the
just
floor to use the
abstract
restroom.
noise in
Which is
Washington.
wild, and it's
This
small
machinery
because the Senate
dictates
is
how long you wait in the
deadlocked
security line
over
before
the
you can see
Save
your family.
America Act.
It
Right, that
dictates
big
whether the
election
federal
overhaul
courts can
bill.
process
It's centered
civil
around
cases.
measures like voter
It
ID
dictates
requirements.
whether millions of
Democrats are
vulnerable
aggressively
citizens
blocking this
receive the
legislation,
nutrition
and
assistance they
Republicans
rely
desperately
on
want
to
to pass it.
survive.
But they
The
lack
timeline
the
of when a
60 votes
politician
required
decides to
break the stalemate.
compromise,
Which means
directly
frustrations
impacts the
are just
timeline of your daily
boiling
life.
over.
And I want
Today,
to
you
leave
have
you with a
28
final
Republican senators,
provocative
people
thought
like Pete
based on
Ricketts
everything
and
we
Cynthia
uncovered in
Lummis
these sources.
demanding
We
that the
discussed
Senate
the
force
loophole that
a
allowed
grueling,
Congress to
physical,
creatively
talking
pre-fund
filibuster.
ICE.
They want
with
to
a
force
massive
Democrats to stand on the
$76
floor and
billion
talk until their vocal
completely
cords just
insulating
give
them
out.
from the
And if that
shutdown.
fails,
The One
they want to
Big
break
Beautiful
the
Bill
standing
Act.
rules of the
Right.
Senate
If Congress has the
entirely
power
to
to
force
do
a
that,
final
are we
vote.
moving toward a
And the
future
real shocker
where
dropped
politicians
just a few
selectively
days ago.
armor their favorite
Senator John
departments to keep
Cornyn,
them running
a man who
smoothly
fiercely
while using
defended the
budgets
old
of
Senate
everyone
rules
else
for his
as
entire
permanent
career,
political weapons?
just
It's a
published
scary
this
thought.
fiery
When you create a
op-ed.
system where
Right,
some
saying
agencies
Republicans
are
must act
structurally
now to get this
bulletproof
bill
and others are
passed.
Yeah, he said
perpetually
they had
held
to deal a
hostage,
fatal blow
you
to the
fundamentally
rules,
alter the
which
concept
instantly
of public
triggered a
service in
massive public
America.
call-out from
Imagine
former
showing
Senator
up
Joe
to work
Manchin.
every single
Manchin
day,
slammed
keeping
Cornyn
millions
online
of people
for,
safe,
well,
knowing your
a massive
paycheck has been
flip-flop.
completely
Because
cut
the
off.
rules of the Senate
For
are
50,000
quite literally
federal
hanging by a
workers
thread
today,
right now. I mean,
that
the
isn't
decisions
a
made
thought
in the next few
experiment,
days
it's
will
their
dictate
reality.
how American laws are
Thanks
written
for
the
joining
next
us on this
century.
deep dive. Stay
Welcome to
curious,
this deep
and we
dive.
will catch you next time.
Today, we